Before you start converting a design, it's important to make an analysis on how that design was created inside of Photoshop. You have to look at the file and deconstruct its major components. And as you're looking at it, you want to look at specific elements and ask yourself the question, can this element be reproduced using CSS? Or is this element something that has to be exported out as a graphic? What we're going to do is we're going to take a look at our monoplate.psd file. This is the layout that we're going to convert into HTML. Now, I already have it open inside of Photoshop, so I'm going to go over to Photoshop to take a look at the document. Once you're inside of Photoshop, you do want to ask yourself some of those questions. Which of these elements can be reproduced using CSS and which can't? Now, right now I have all sorts of guides set up which make it a little bit more difficult to see the content. So what I'm going to do is come up to the View menu, and under the View menu, I'm just going to turn off Extras. At that point, I want to focus mainly on the top portion. But as we look at this, we can see that it's following a standard grid layout. And what we want to do is be able to reproduce this in HTML. So let's go ahead and zoom into some of these areas so we can get a more detailed look at some of its components. If you don't know how to use the zoom tool, you can always access it by using the keyboard shortcut, which is Control Spacebar on a Windows machine. It's Command Spacebar on the Macintosh. Again, like I said, it's important to be able to deconstruct this. As you practice more and more with layouts inside of Photoshop, looking at the major components ultimately is going to make you more productive when you have to write code. You need to have essentially a checklist where you can go through and look at each element and figure out what can be reproduced in CSS and what can't. And oftentimes, it's not cut and dry. It's not, yes, it can be reproduced in CSS, or no, it can't. In some cases, some aspects of it can be reproduced in CSS and others cannot. So there's a lot to look at and there's a lot to consider. So by looking at the layout and analyzing what needs to be done, ultimately will save you a lot of time. For example, you can see inside the Layers panel, I have different sections of the document broken up into different layer groups. I have the top, I have the header, I have the page, and I also have the footer, which obviously is down below. As we look at some of these components, we can see that we have an image in the background up here towards the top. This is something that probably can't be reproduced inside of CSS, so we're going to have to take a look at how we could export this artwork. We also have a gradient in the background of the header and also the page. Gradients can be reproduced now with CSS3, so depending upon the project's needs, that may be a consideration. Also, if we take a look at the buttons down here, the buttons really use a combination of CSS properties and graphics. Borders, shadows, those types of things can be reproduced using CSS. However, this little grid gradient that you see in the background, again, that's something that can't be reproduced in CSS. So we're going to have to use a combination of CSS properties and images that we're going to export out of Photoshop. In the next movie, we're going to start to deconstruct the layout section by section, and we're going to look at the images that we're going to have to consider exporting when we try to convert this layout to HTML.